When Captain Richards clutched his chest at 38,000 feet, panic swept through the cockpit. Then, over the intercom, a soft teenage voice cut through the chaos with 3 impossible words that would save 230 lives: "I can fly." Nobody expected those words from a 17-year-old girl in seat 14A. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The pre-dawn darkness still covered Boston Logan International Airport as 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell walked through the nearly empty terminal toward gate C-22. She wore comfortable black leggings, an oversized gray sweatshirt from her high school, and carried a worn backpack covered in patches from various aviation museums. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she clutched a large coffee cup as she dragged her small carry-on suitcase behind her. To the handful of early morning travelers, she looked like any college-bound student heading home for break, tired and probably scrolling through social media to stay awake during the early departure. Gate agent Marcus Thompson greeted passengers with practiced cheerfulness despite the 5:30 a.m. boarding time. When Sarah approached with her boarding pass, he smiled warmly. "Early flight for a Saturday morning. Heading home or heading out?" Sarah returned the smile and said she was going to visit her aunt in Denver. Marcus nodded sympathetically. "Well, try to get some sleep on the flight. We should have you there by 8:30 Mountain Time." He scanned her pass and waved her through, already looking past her to the next passenger. She was just another young traveler, unremarkable and forgettable in the steady stream of people passing through his gate every day. Sarah settled into seat 14A, a window seat about halfway back in the economy cabin of the Boeing 757. She stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her, keeping her phone and a thick paperback novel within easy reach. The novel's cover showed dramatic clouds and an aircraft silhouette, clearly an aviation thriller, the kind of book that airport bookstores stocked by the dozens. A businessman taking the seat across the aisle, Mr. Chen, an accountant heading to a conference, glanced at her book and smiled. "Looks exciting. Better than the quarterly reports I'll be reading." Sarah laughed politely and agreed, opening the book to a dog-eared page. What Mr. Chen couldn't see was that Sarah's book had handwritten notes in the margins, technical annotations about flight procedures, emergency protocols, and aircraft systems. What he didn't know was that the college student beside him had spent the past 6 years obsessively studying aviation, accumulating over 500 hours in advanced flight simulators, and earning a private pilot license just 3 months after her 17th birthday. Her father owned a small aviation training company, and Sarah had grown up around aircraft, spending countless hours learning everything from basic aerodynamics to complex emergency procedures. She had logged actual flight time in small single-engine planes and had even practiced approaches in a professional Boeing simulator that her father's company used for training. But Sarah kept this knowledge carefully hidden from casual observers. She had learned that mentioning her aviation passion to strangers led to uncomfortable conversations filled with skepticism and patronizing comments about her age and gender. Adults would smile indulgently and treat her interest as a cute hobby rather than serious expertise. So she had learned to blend in, to appear as unremarkable as possible, just another teenager traveling alone. Flight 447 to Denver began boarding the remaining passengers as the sky outside started showing the first hints of dawn. Captain Michael Richards and First Officer Amanda Torres completed their pre-flight checks in the cockpit, reviewing weather reports, fuel calculations, and the flight plan that would take them across the country. Captain Richards was 54 years old, a veteran with 28 years of commercial flying experience and an impeccable safety record. He was known among crew members as steady, professional, and unflappable. First Officer Torres was 32, sharp and capable, with 8 years of commercial experience. Together, they made a solid crew that had flown together dozens of times. Lead Flight Attendant Diana Park made her way through the cabin, checking that passengers had stowed their belongings properly and that overhead bins were secured. She paused at Sarah's row with a friendly smile. "All set, hon. Can I get you a pillow or blanket for the flight?" Sarah declined politely, thanking her. Diana moved on, her attention already shifting to an elderly passenger who needed help with a heavy bag. Sarah was invisible in the best possible way, a quiet, polite teenager who wouldn't cause any trouble during the 3-hour flight. The Boeing 757 pushed back from the gate precisely on schedule at 5:40 a.m. Captain Richard's voice came over the intercom with the standard announcement, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 447 to Denver, announcing the flight time of 3 hours and 15 minutes, mentioning the weather in Denver, clear skies and 42 degrees, and wishing everyone a pleasant journey. His voice was calm and authoritative, the voice of someone who had made this announcement thousands of times. Nothing in his tone suggested that this flight would be anything other than routine. Takeoff was smooth and professional. Sarah felt the familiar acceleration as the engines powered up, the rotation point as the nose lifted, and the gentle sensation of leaving the ground. Through her window, she watched Boston's lights falling away below, the geometric patterns of streets and buildings becoming abstract as the aircraft climbed. The landing gear retracted with its characteristic sound. The aircraft banked slightly, turning westward to begin its cross-country journey. Everything was perfectly normal, exactly as it should be on a routine commercial flight. For the first 90 minutes, Flight 447 proceeded without incident. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet and settled into smooth flight. The seatbelt sign turned off, and flight attendants began their beverage service. Diana stopped at Sarah's row with her cart. "What can I get you, sweetie? Orange juice? Coffee?" Sarah requested water and a small bag of pretzels. Diana poured the water into a plastic cup and handed over the snacks with a smile, then continued down the aisle. Mr. Chen ordered coffee and asked for extra cream. Around the cabin, passengers settled into their flights, some sleeping, others reading, a few working on laptops. Sarah had just returned to her aviation thriller when she heard something that made her look up sharply. It was subtle, a slight change in engine tone that most passengers wouldn't notice. Her trained ear caught it immediately, a barely perceptible fluctuation that suggested something had changed in the aircraft systems. She listened intently, her book forgotten. The sound normalized after a few seconds, but Sarah remained alert, watching and listening for any other anomalies. 10 minutes later, the cockpit call button chimed in the galley. Diana picked up the phone, expecting a routine request. What she heard instead made her face go pale. She hung up quickly and moved rapidly toward the cockpit, her professional composure cracking slightly. Passengers near the front noticed her urgency and began exchanging worried glances. Sarah sat up straighter, every sense alert now. Something was wrong. Diana disappeared into the cockpit, and for nearly a minute, there was only the normal sound of engines and air circulation. Then Diana emerged, her face showing barely controlled fear, and grabbed the intercom handset. Her voice, when she spoke, was shaking despite her obvious attempt to remain calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. If there is a doctor, nurse, or anyone with medical training on board, please identify yourself immediately by pressing your call button. This is urgent." The cabin erupted in alarmed murmurs. Call buttons began chiming throughout the aircraft as several passengers responded. Diana moved quickly down the aisle, checking each person who had signaled. A retired nurse from seat 8C. A medical student from seat 22F. A paramedic from seat 31B. Diana quickly gathered them and rushed them toward the front of the aircraft. Sarah watched this unfold with growing concern, her aviation knowledge telling her that a medical emergency serious enough to require multiple responders was extremely serious. 5 minutes passed. The medical personnel remained in the cockpit. Passengers were now openly worried, talking in nervous voices, craning their necks to see what was happening. A woman 2 rows ahead was crying quietly. Mr. Chen had put down his reports and was gripping his armrests, his earlier calm completely gone. Sarah's mind was racing through possibilities. A pilot medical emergency was rare but not unheard of. Pilots underwent regular medical examinations precisely to prevent such situations, but they could still happen. Heart attacks, strokes, sudden incapacitations. Diana emerged again, and this time her professional composure had completely shattered. She looked terrified as she grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention immediately. We have a critical emergency. Captain Richards has suffered a medical emergency, and we need someone with flight experience. Does anyone on this aircraft have any pilot training or flight experience? If you do, please identify yourself immediately. This is a life-or-death emergency." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. People gasped. A child started crying. Someone screamed. The calm routine of the flight disintegrated into fear and chaos. Passengers were shouting questions, demanding information, some praying audibly. The businessman across from Sarah turned white as paper. "Oh God! Oh God, we're going to crash," he whispered, his voice breaking. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were shaking. She was 17 years old. She had never flown a commercial jet, only small single-engine planes and simulators. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to let adults handle this, to not put this impossible burden on herself. But she knew the statistics. She knew that without a pilot, this aircraft would eventually run out of fuel or encounter weather or face any number of scenarios that would end in catastrophe. 230 people would die. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from countless training sessions. "Sarah, knowledge without action is worthless. If you have the ability to help and you don't act, you're choosing to let bad things happen. Emergency situations don't care about your comfort or your fear. They only care about competence and courage." Sarah pressed her call button. The chime was barely audible over the noise in the cabin, but Diana saw the light illuminate and rushed to her row. "Yes. Do you need something?" Diana's voice was sharp with stress and desperation. Sarah looked up at her and spoke clearly, though her voice shook slightly. "I have flight training. I'm a licensed pilot. I have simulator experience on Boeing aircraft. I can help." Diana stared at her in disbelief. "How old are you?" The question came out almost as an accusation. 17, Sarah answered honestly. "But I have over 500 hours in simulators including this aircraft type. I have my private pilot license. My father runs an aviation training company. I know emergency procedures." Diana's expression cycled through disbelief, hope, desperation, and finally grim acceptance. "Come with me. Now." She grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her from her seat. Mr. Chen and other nearby passengers stared in shocked confusion as the teenage girl was rushed toward the cockpit. Behind her, Sarah could hear passengers' voices rising in alarm and disbelief. The cockpit was a scene of controlled chaos. Captain Richards was slumped in the left seat, unconscious, his face gray and sweating. The retired nurse was monitoring his pulse while the paramedic was preparing an automated external defibrillator. First Officer Torres was in the right seat, her face showing intense stress as she flew the aircraft alone while simultaneously trying to coordinate the emergency response. She looked up as Diana brought Sarah into the cockpit, and confusion crossed her face. "Who is this?" "Diana, I asked for a pilot, not a passenger." Diana's voice was desperate. "She says she's a licensed pilot with simulator experience on this aircraft type. She's all we have." Nobody else came forward. Torres looked at Sarah with an expression mixing disbelief and desperation. "How old are you? What's your experience?" Sarah forced her voice to remain steady. 17. Private pilot license. 500 hours simulator time including Boeing 757 and 737. My father owns Mitchell Aviation Training. I've trained on emergency procedures extensively. Torres made a decision in seconds, born of the simple reality that she had no other options. "Can you handle radio communication and systems monitoring while I fly?" Sarah nodded immediately. "Yes. I can do that." Torres gestured to the jump seat behind the captain's position. Sit there. Put on a headset. Monitor the instruments and tell me immediately if anything changes. Handle any radio calls. I need you to be my eyes and ears so I can focus on flying. Sarah slid into the jump seat, her hands trembling as she put on the headset. The cockpit was overwhelming, hundreds of switches, displays, and controls surrounding her. But her training took over, and she began systematically scanning the instruments. Altitude, 38,000 feet. Airspeed, 480 knots. Heading, westbound. Engine instruments normal. Fuel sufficient for approximately 2 more hours. Hydraulics normal. All major systems showing green. Behind her, the medical team was working frantically on Captain Richards. The paramedic spoke urgently. He's had a major cardiac event. Heart attack, possibly massive. We've got the AED on him, but he needs immediate hospital care. How long until we can land? Torres' voice was tight with stress. We're approximately 90 minutes from Denver at current speed. I can request emergency priority, but that's still the closest suitable airport. Sarah keyed the radio, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. Denver Center, this is United Flight 447, declaring an emergency. We have pilot incapacitation due to medical emergency. Requesting priority handling and vectors direct to Denver International. Medical emergency services will be needed on arrival. The air traffic controller's response came immediately, his professional tone carrying an edge of concern. United 447, Denver Center, copy your emergency. You are cleared direct Denver International. Descend and maintain flight level 350. Emergency services are being notified. Can you confirm the status of your flight crew? Sarah glanced at Torres, who nodded for her to continue. Denver Center, 447, we have one pilot operating the aircraft. Captain is incapacitated and receiving medical treatment. First Officer Torres is flying. We have a licensed pilot assisting with communication and systems. It wasn't a complete picture, but it was accurate enough for the moment. The controller didn't need to know right now that the licensed pilot was a teenager with only small aircraft experience. Torres began the descent, her movements smooth and professional despite the stress. Sarah monitored the instruments, calling out any changes. Altitude passing through 37,000. Descent rate 2,000 feet per minute. All systems normal. Torres nodded acknowledgement. Good. Keep watching fuel. Calculate our endurance and time to Denver. Sarah did the mental math quickly, one of the countless calculations she had practiced in simulators. Current fuel state gives us approximately 2 hours 20 minutes endurance. Distance to Denver is 430 nautical miles. At current speed, that's 54 minutes flight time. We have adequate fuel with reserves. Torres managed a tight smile. You know your numbers. Good. The next hour was the most intense of Sarah's life. She monitored every system, called out altitude and speed updates, handled radio communications with increasing confidence, and helped Torres run through checklists for the approach and landing. The first officer's initial skepticism had transformed into cautious trust as Sarah demonstrated her knowledge and competence. They worked together with growing coordination, Torres flying while Sarah managed everything else. In the cabin, Diana had made an announcement explaining that a medical emergency had incapacitated the captain but that the first officer was flying with assistance and they would be landing in Denver shortly. She carefully avoided mentioning Sarah's age or limited experience. The passengers remained terrified but somewhat calmer knowing that someone was actively flying the aircraft. The medical team continued working on Captain Richards, whose condition remained critical but stable. As Flight 447 approached Denver, Torres looked at Sarah with an expression of grim determination. I need you to do more than monitor now. I need you to actively assist. Can you handle the radio calls, the checklist readings, and the landing configuration while I focus entirely on flying the approach? Sarah's mouth went dry, but she nodded. Yes. I can do that. Torres' voice softened slightly. Listen to me, Sarah. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But you've been incredible so far. Your training is solid. Your knowledge is real. I need you to keep being that competent pilot you've been for the past hour. Can you do that? Sarah took a deep breath and met Torres' eyes. Yes, I can do that. The approach to Denver was textbook perfect despite the emergency circumstances. Sarah handled all radio communications with increasing confidence, calling out altitude checkpoints and configuration changes. Gear down, 3 green. Flaps 30. Landing checklist complete. Stabilized on approach. Torres flew with intense concentration, her hands steady on the controls. The runway appeared ahead, emergency vehicles lined up along the taxiway with lights flashing. Sarah keyed the radio one final time. Denver Tower, United 447 on final, runway 34 right. The tower controller responded immediately. United 447, cleared to land, runway 34 right. Emergency equipment standing by. Good luck. Torres brought the aircraft across the threshold at exactly the correct speed and height, executing a smooth flare and touchdown that barely registered as a bump. She deployed the thrust reversers and brakes, bringing the massive aircraft to a controlled stop on the runway. United 447 is stopped on the runway. We need immediate medical attention for our captain. Sarah's voice was steady as she made the call. Within seconds, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Paramedics rushed aboard with equipment, taking over care of Captain Richards from the passenger medical team. He was transferred to a stretcher and rushed to a waiting ambulance, still unconscious but with stable vital signs. Torres sat back in her seat, hands shaking now that the emergency was over. She looked at Sarah with an expression of awe and gratitude. You just helped save 230 lives. You were incredible. I couldn't have done this alone. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. I just did what you needed me to do. Diana appeared in the cockpit doorway, tears streaming down her face. The paramedics say Captain Richards is stable. They think he'll make it because we got him to the hospital so quickly. You both saved his life and everyone on this aircraft. She looked at Sarah with wonder. How did you stay so calm? You're just a kid. Sarah managed a weak smile. My dad always said that in emergencies, age doesn't matter. Competence matters. Training matters. Staying calm matters. I just tried to remember everything he taught me. The evacuation of passengers was orderly, with everyone leaving through the main doors to waiting buses. As passengers filed past the cockpit, many stopped to look at Torres and Sarah, their expressions showing gratitude, amazement, and lingering shock. Mr. Chen, the businessman who had sat across from Sarah, stopped and stared at her with tears in his eyes. I saw you reading that aviation book. I thought you were just a kid interested in planes. You saved my life. You saved all of us. Thank you. Airport officials, FAA representatives, and airline management descended on the aircraft as soon as passengers had evacuated. Torres immediately took charge of the situation, giving a rapid briefing. This is Sarah Mitchell. She's a licensed private pilot who assisted me throughout this emergency. Her knowledge, her competence, and her composure were essential to the successful outcome of this event. Without her help, I would have been overwhelmed trying to fly the aircraft, manage the emergency, and coordinate everything alone. She performed at the level of a professional flight crew member. The FAA investigator, a serious man named Robert Davidson, looked at Sarah with an expression mixing skepticism and curiosity. You're 17 years old with a private pilot license and you assisted in flying a commercial Boeing 757 during an emergency. Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling very young and very tired. I did what First Officer Torres needed me to do. I monitored systems, handled communications, ran checklists. She flew the aircraft. I just helped. Davidson's expression softened slightly. Don't minimize what you did. What you're describing is the job of a first officer. You functioned as a flight crew member during a critical emergency. He paused, making notes. We'll need to conduct a full investigation, review the cockpit voice recordings and flight data, interview everyone involved. But preliminarily, based on First Officer Torres' account and what I'm hearing, you may have helped prevent a major disaster. The hours that followed were a blur of interviews, medical evaluations, and debriefings. Sarah's father received an emergency call and caught the next flight to Denver, arriving 6 hours later to find his daughter at the center of an international media sensation. The story had already broken, news outlets worldwide were reporting the dramatic emergency landing and the teenage girl who had helped save Flight 447. David Mitchell, Sarah's father, embraced his daughter tightly, tears streaming down his face. I taught you everything I could, but I never imagined you'd have to use it like this. You were incredible. You made me so proud. Sarah finally allowed herself to break down completely, crying in her father's arms as the stress and fear of the past hours crashed over her. Captain Richards underwent emergency surgery and survived the massive heart attack. His recovery would be long, and he would never fly commercially again, but he lived because of the quick emergency landing. When he was able to speak days later, his first words to the media were about Sarah. That young woman helped save my life and the lives of everyone aboard. First Officer Torres did an outstanding job flying the aircraft, but Sarah made it possible for Amanda to focus on flying by handling everything else. They worked together like a professional crew. I owe her everything. First Officer Amanda Torres became Sarah's strongest advocate in the investigation that followed. She testified in detail about Sarah's competence, knowledge, and composure. She wasn't just a passenger helping out. She functioned as a genuine crew member. Her radio communications were professional and precise. Her systems knowledge was solid. Her checklist discipline was perfect. Most importantly, she never panicked, never froze, never made the situation worse. She made it better. Without her, I would have been task-saturated and overwhelmed. She gave me the ability to focus on flying by taking everything else off my plate. The investigation concluded 3 months later with findings that praised both Torres and Sarah while also raising questions about procedures for handling dual-pilot incapacitation scenarios. The report specifically noted that Sarah's assistance had been essential to the successful outcome, and that her performance exceeded reasonable expectations for someone with her level of experience and training. The FAA used the incident as a case study in emergency resource management and the importance of recognizing competence regardless of age. Media coverage was intense and largely positive, though some critics questioned whether regulations should prevent minors from accessing cockpits during emergencies. Aviation experts responded by pointing out that emergency situations by definition involved extraordinary measures, and that refusing Sarah's help would have been absurd given the circumstances. The debate raged in aviation circles for months. Sarah's life changed dramatically. She received scholarship offers from aviation universities, was invited to speak at aviation conferences, and became the youngest recipient of the FAA Certificate of Achievement for Extraordinary Service. Airlines expressed interest in fast-tracking her through training programs when she came of age. She appeared on news programs and talk shows, always deflecting praise to First Officer Torres and emphasizing the importance of training and preparation. But through all the attention, Sarah remained remarkably grounded. She finished her senior year of high school, applied to aviation universities, and continued building flight hours. She stayed in contact with Torres, who became both a friend and mentor. They met regularly, and Torres guided Sarah through the steps needed to pursue a career in commercial aviation. 2 years later, when Sarah turned 19, she earned her commercial pilot license with instrument and multi-engine ratings. Amanda Torres was there for the check ride, watching with pride as Sarah demonstrated the same competence and composure she had shown during the emergency. Torres hugged her afterward. "You were a pilot that day on Flight 447. Today you became a professional pilot. Your dad would be incredibly proud." "I know I am." The passengers of Flight 447 formed a group that stayed connected through social media and annual gatherings. They never forgot the day a teenage girl's voice cut through their panic with 3 impossible words that turned out to be true. Many of them attended Sarah's commercial license celebration, wanting to be part of her continuing story. Mr. Chen, the businessman who had sat next to her, brought his entire family to meet her. "I tell everyone about the day I sat next to a hero and didn't even know it. You changed my life. You gave me more years to watch my kids grow up. Thank you." Sarah eventually joined a regional airline as a first officer, beginning the long process of building the thousands of hours needed for a major airline career. She flew the same routes repeatedly, accumulating experience and refining her skills. She was patient, understanding that expertise came through time and repetition. But she never forgot Flight 447, the day when training met opportunity in the most dramatic possible way. Years later, when Sarah was asked in an interview what she would say to young people interested in aviation, she thought carefully before answering. First, train seriously. Knowledge saves lives. Second, don't let anyone tell you you're too young to be competent. Age and experience aren't the same thing. Third, if you have the ability to help in an emergency, you have the responsibility to help. And finally, remember that you never know when your training will matter. I thought I was just taking a routine flight to visit my aunt. Instead, I found myself helping to save 230 lives. Be ready for the moment when it comes. The legacy of Flight 447 extended far beyond Sarah's personal story. Aviation training programs began emphasizing earlier introduction to cockpit procedures and emergency management. The concept of recognizing non-traditional resources during emergencies gained acceptance in crisis management circles. Airlines updated their protocols for handling medical emergencies affecting flight crews. Academic researchers studied the psychological aspects of Sarah's performance under extreme stress, trying to understand how a teenager had maintained such remarkable composure. For Sarah herself, the memory of that day never faded. She carried the weight of those hours in the cockpit as both a burden and a source of strength. When she faced challenges in her career, she remembered that if she could function as a crew member during a desperate emergency at 17, she could handle whatever difficulties came her way. When she eventually became a flight instructor years later, she told her students about Flight 447, using it to illustrate the importance of preparation, composure, and the willingness to act when action was needed. First Officer Amanda Torres eventually became Captain Torres, earning her 4th stripe and commanding her own flights. She often told the story of Flight 447 during training sessions, emphasizing the importance of resource management and recognizing help when it appeared from unexpected sources. "I had a 17-year-old private pilot help me save 230 lives because I was willing to look past age and see competence. If I had refused her help because of her age, people would have died." Remember that lesson. Competence comes in all ages and forms. Your job in an emergency is to recognize it and use it. The flight attendants from Flight 447, led by Diana Park, remained close to both Sarah and Torres. Diana often said that the emergency had taught her to never underestimate passengers based on appearance. "I saw a teenage girl with a novel and assumed she was just another young traveler. I almost missed the fact that she was the answer to our desperate crisis. Now I know better." You never really know who's sitting in those seats or what they're capable of until the moment demands it. Captain Michael Richards made a full recovery from his heart attack and lived for many more years, though he never returned to flying. He became an advocate for improved cardiovascular screening for pilots and spoke frequently about the importance of emergency preparedness. He credited Sarah and Torres with saving his life and never failed to mention them when discussing the incident. "I'm alive because 2 incredible women, one experienced and one very young, worked together perfectly under impossible pressure. They were heroes, both of them. The passengers never forgot their brush with disaster and the teenage voice that had helped save them. Many changed careers, pursued dreams they had postponed, or made major life changes after facing their mortality so directly. They sent cards to Sarah on the anniversary of Flight 447 every year, thanking her for the gift of additional years with their families. Some named daughters after her. Others established scholarships in her name for young women pursuing aviation careers. Sarah eventually achieved her goal of flying for a major airline, reaching the captain's seat at age 32, relatively young for that accomplishment. Her first flight as captain was emotional, with several Flight 447 passengers booking seats specifically to fly with her. When she made her welcome announcement, she mentioned Flight 447 briefly, thanking the passengers who had traveled to be part of her first command. The cabin erupted in applause. She was just a girl in seat 14A, reading an aviation thriller and drinking water from a plastic cup. But when disaster struck at 38,000 feet and a heart attack incapacitated the captain, her voice cut through the chaos with 3 words that nobody expected but everyone desperately needed to hear: "I can fly." Those words, spoken by a 17-year-old with hidden expertise and remarkable courage, saved 230 lives and changed aviation history. The story of Flight 447 became legend in aviation circles, taught in training programs as an example of resource management, crew coordination, and the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its source. Sarah Mitchell became a symbol of preparation meeting opportunity, of youth proving itself in the most demanding circumstances, of courage found in unexpected places. She never sought fame or attention, preferring to let her continuing career speak for itself. But she never denied the story either, understanding that it could inspire others to pursue aviation and to trust their training when crisis demanded action. Years later, Sarah and Amanda Torres were invited to speak together at an aviation safety conference. They stood on stage, the teenager and the first officer who had saved Flight 447 together, now both airline captains with distinguished careers. Torres spoke first, describing the technical aspects of the emergency and praising Sarah's contribution. Then Sarah took the microphone and spoke words that would be repeated in aviation training for generations. People ask me if I was scared that day. Of course I was terrified. But I had trained for situations like that, and when the moment came, I remembered my father's words. He always said that training is the gift you give your future self for the moment when everything depends on what you know and what you can do. That day on Flight 447, I unwrapped that gift. The training he gave me, the hours in simulators, the emergency procedures I had memorized, all of it mattered. All of it saved lives. So train seriously. Learn completely. And when your moment comes, trust what you know and do what needs to be done. That's all I did. That's all any of us can do. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Among the crowd were aviation students who would go on to successful careers, inspired by her story. Among them were instructors who would teach emergency procedures with new emphasis, remembering how a teenage girl's training had saved hundreds. Among them were the survivors of Flight 447, who stood and applauded longer than anyone, remembering the voice that had saved them. The pilot had a heart attack mid-flight. Then a girl's voice said, "I can fly." And 230 people lived because those words were true.